Chapter 21, Rebellion. The principal's office looked way too familiar to me. The one big difference was that today there were so many people in the room that they couldn't all fit at the round table. One lady was sitting at Mrs. Hackney's desk. I knew who she was because I'd seen her on cable TV. It was Mrs. Tursum, the school superintendent. Mrs. Burns sat in a folding chair next to the principal's desk. Mrs. Drummond, the guidance counselor, was there too. And beside her was Mrs. Anderson, the school secretary. She had a notepad on her lap, ready to keep track of who said what. Mrs. Hackney sat at her usual spot at the table. Dr. Trindle sat on her left, and then there was Mrs. Noyes and Mrs. Zhang. My mom's eyebrows went up when she saw Stephen and his mom and dad sitting at the table. I wasn't surprised at all. I'd have been amazed not to see them there. But then came Merton Lake and both his parents, and I had no clue why they were at the meeting. Stephen caught my eye as I took a chair at the table, and I saw the slightest flicker of a smile. I looked away. There are times when nothing is more dangerous than a smile. This was one of those times. About 10 minutes after Mom and I sat down, my dad came rushing in, nodded a few quick hellos around the table, and took the seat next to me. Then Mrs. Hackney said, "It's been quite a morning here at Philbrook Elementary School. Mrs. Noyes, please begin by telling us what happened during your third period social studies class." Mrs. Noyes nodded at Mrs. Hackney and said, "I had prepared a 12-question quiz from the weekend reading assignment to the social studies book. We talked about the chapter, and then I passed out the quiz. It was 1 page. When everyone was finished, I had the students exchange papers, take out their red pencils, and begin discussing the answers. There was a lot of laughing as we corrected the quiz, so I began walking around the room. And I saw that almost every student had written a nonsense answer to every question." Mrs. Hackney said, "A nonsense answer?" "Yes," said Mrs. Noyes. "For example, on the question, who was the President of the United States at the start of the Great Depression, students wrote answers like Donald Duck, or Elvis, or my Uncle Lenny. Very silly and wrong." Mrs. Hackney said, "And what grade did most of your students get on the quiz?" Mrs. Noyes glanced at me before she answered. 0. All but 2 of them got a 0. And then during 4th period, when the other half of the blue team has social studies, I warned the class before the quiz that there was to be no funny business. But when the quizzes were graded, it was the same thing, all 0s, except for 2 of the students who didn't participate in the silliness. I'd have bet anything that one of those 2 kids was Merton Lake, but it wasn't important at the moment. Mrs. Hackney said, "Who wants to start explaining this?" Stephen and I both said I do at the same moment, but I was the one who kept talking. "It's all my fault, Mrs. Hackney. I got this idea that if I could get some 0s on tests, and then we talked some of the other kids about getting some 0s. We could get people to notice how everyone is so crazy about grades and test scores all the time, and how that's kind of a problem. So this thing was my fault." Stephen shook his head and said, "That was my idea, the part about getting 0s. And then we worked on the plan some more together. But that part was my idea, remember?" At that moment, I wished Stephen could be a little less honest, because then he could have seen that I wasn't trying to steal the credit for his idea. I was trying to keep us both from getting run out of town by an angry mob of teachers and parents. But Stephen wasn't clever that way, and there wasn't a sneaky bone in his body, which is one of the things I've always liked best about him. So I said, "Okay, yes, that part was your idea. But I was the one who was putting the idea into action. I was the one who started things off by getting some zeros last Friday. And then we didn't talk this weekend, and I guess you must have called a bunch of kids, right? And that's why everyone else got zeros today. But it's still really my fault, and I'm sorry. And now it's all over. Mrs. Hackney said, I wish it were that simple, Nora, but it's not. First, there's the matter of this handbill that Stephen was trying to pass out in the halls today. She passed a sheet of paper to her left and right. I stared at my copy as Mrs. Hackney read the words aloud. Calling all kids. Tired of stupid tests? Tired of fighting for grades? Do you hate those mastery tests? Then join the rebellion. Enlist today. How? Simple. Get a 0 on your next test. Let's show everybody that we can think for ourselves. Questions? Asked Stephen Curtis. Mrs. Hackney looked at Stephen and then around the room. Rebellion, she said, is not something we need or want at Philbrook Elementary School. I was stunned. I couldn't believe Stephen had done something so bold, and he had put his name on that thing. And then he'd gotten all but 2 of the kids in our team to actually do it, too. Stephen must have talked on the phone the whole weekend. Mrs. Hackney continued. And then there's the matter of Stephen and Merton's fight. Mr. Lake raised his hand and said, I don't accept that. It was not a fight, he pointed at Stephen. That child attacked my son, and Merton was forced to defend himself. And don't forget that Merton is one of the 2 students that did not go along with this conspiracy. I'd never seen Merton's dad before, but I was guessing he was a lawyer. Mrs. Curtis glared at him and said, Stephen has never attacked anyone in his life. Mrs. Hackney said, please, let's stay focused here. There was a shoving match in front of the school this morning, and it looked like trouble to the teacher who was out there on bus duty, and Mrs. Byrne had to pull both boys apart to stop it. Isn't that right? Mrs. Byrne nodded. Yes, it wasn't exactly a fight, but it was certainly headed that way. It was a definite skirmish. I almost smiled at her. Leave it to Mrs. Byrne to find the perfect word, skirmish. Mrs. Hackney said, very well. I'd like to summarize our situation. We have 2 students who have admitted that they have organized and encouraged rebellious behavior, and we have 2 boys who were nearly fighting. But our most serious problem is that half of the 5th grade decided to treat 2 quizzes as if they did not matter at all. They treated their schoolwork like it was a big joke. Mrs. Hackney glanced around the table. Then she looked right at me and said, a disobedient attitude has been set loose in our school, and we have to stop it now. The lady sitting at Mrs. Hackney's desk stood up. Everybody turned to look at her, and she said, I'm Julia Tursum, Superintendent of Schools. When I spoke with Miss Hackney an hour ago, I advised her to isolate the blue team students from the other children in the school. That's why they've all been in the library for the past 45 minutes. The nurse and custodian are acting as emergency substitutes so their regular teachers could be here at this meeting. Mrs. Tursum paused. There's a special way that presidents and mayors stand and tilt their heads and hold their hands when they give important speeches. That is how Mrs. Tursum looked. She swung her eyes slowly across the audience and said, about a year ago, we had a problem with vandalism at the junior high school. Lockers were damaged, mirrors in the washrooms were broken, walls were written on, and books were destroyed. And I'm sorry to report that it took more than 8 months to get that vandalism completely stopped. Why did it take so long? It's very simple. because the principal of that school did not jump on the problem soon enough or hard enough. Our situation today is not quite as serious as vandalism, but it's not so different either. If the children who got zeros on those quizzes go to lunch 40 minutes from now and start laughing and bragging about what they've done, this defiant attitude could easily spread to the rest of the school. And that must not happen. That is why we have to handle this problem forcefully and immediately. Every student in the Philbrook schools must understand that tests and grades are serious business. Every student in our schools must always try to do his or her best to earn excellent scores. That's what education in Philbrook is all about, excellence. And right now, those students in the library are confused about that. So, we've got to solve this problem in the next 30 minutes. Mrs. Hackney?